Welcome everyone. My name is Leslie Kirby and I'm the chair of the Community Relations Committee of the Jewish Federation and Jewish Foundation of Nashville and Middle Tennessee. And we are also co-sponsored by the Nashville Jewish Social Justice Roundtable. And today we're welcoming Sabina Mohyuddin, who's the executive director of the American Muslim Advisory Council. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Sabina and then let her talk about recent events in the community. Sabina is a Bangladeshi American Muslim born and raised in Nashville. She graduated from Vanderbilt in 1993 with a degree in mechanical engineering. She's a founding board member and currently the executive director of the American Muslim Advisory Council, which empowers the Muslim community in Tennessee through civic engagement, community building, and improved media relations. So they're basically the parallel to the CRC in the Muslim community. Sabina is going to share about current issues facing the Muslim community. And Sabina, I'm going to start by asking you to talk about the ad in the Tennessean recently. When did you first become aware of the ad?
Thank you, Leslie, for having me here today. So the ad for the Tennessean, it was Sunday morning. Of course, I like to sleep in. And when I got up and I was just scrolling through Facebook, I guess like many of us do, just kind of sit in bed. You don't really want to get up. And then I saw someone post it. And then for me, it was like, there goes my Sunday. And that was kind of, I think, more the reaction that, now I got to deal with this because of just such an outrageous ad, right? If you read it, you can't believe the claims that it was making. But for me, I have lived in Tullahoma, Tennessee. It's about 75 miles outside of Nashville, small rural Tennessee, mostly white town. There were 3 Muslim families. It was like my family, my brother-in-law and sister-in-law's family. So in the middle of the Bible Belt, church around every corner, literally down one street, it was around every corner. And so I had seen in the local newspaper ads from churches that groups were coming in to talk about end of time prophecies. And I know with my Jewish brothers and sisters, that Christian end of time prophecies don't pan out very well for us. And so this wasn't surprising that end of time prophecy group would say something like that. What was surprising and hurtful was that the Tennessean would publish it. And so I think that to me, that was the issue for the larger Muslim community who haven't really studied Islamophobia or how it works, that doesn't have that level of experience. I think they were really shocked and hurt and traumatized that someone was accusing Muslims of detonating a nuclear bomb in Nashville. And so most of our community, that was what they felt. For me, it was just like, I know these groups exist out there, know that they do it, but why in the world would the Tennessean publish an ad like that? And so the whole day—
to interrupt you just briefly. Some of the people may not have seen the ad, and you probably don't want to describe the full details of it because it was so outlandish.
Yeah. Okay, I'll give some background.
Yeah, give a little bit of background for people who didn't see the ad.
Okay, so the ad had a picture on the top of it of President Trump and the Pope. And of course, images of the American flag up there. But then it was like a letter to Nashvillians kind of warning that Islam, not even Muslims, Islam is going to detonate a nuclear bomb in Nashville on July 18th. And then it went on and talk. I honestly, I probably read it once through and through, because I think the first two lines was enough to say.
Don't blame
But
me.
so this idea, end of times are coming, and this person made this prediction, and they made predictions before, and so that's why it was a warning for Nashvillians. And so it was a full page ad. It was a full page ad, and so and a little bit of context, because of course, immediately posted on social media, and spend the day trying to call the Tennessean. Some of their editors were on furlough, and so it took them a little time before they responded. Excuse me. And but they responded, and their response was like, "We don't know how that got there." They were embarrassed about it also, and they were like, "This does not meet their journalism standards." Even though it was an ad, if they knew about it, they would not have published it. And that was from the editors. And so, and then from the sales, the vice president of sales at the Tennessean, he was very apologetic. How did this make it there? But this, on Sunday, we found out that this wasn't the first ad, that a couple of days before, the same group ran another ad. And that ad did not mention Muslims. It was still a full page ad. It looked very similar. It looked identical, except the wording to the Sunday's ad, but the wording was different. And the ad talked about COVID-19, kind of COVID-19 conspiracy theories, and kind of led up to something more is coming. And so kind of set the stage for that second ad to come out on Sunday. And so, so the Tennessean, they were apologetic, and so their explanation and why the ad ran was because somebody in the advertising department, sales department, flagged it as problematic, but it was sent to a manager who did not read it, but decided just to publish it without reading it, even though it was flagged. And then two other people who did the printing, whatever, they didn't read it. And, and my comeback was like, if you had read that first ad, even though it didn't mention Muslims, you would have known that something good was not going to come out of this. And so, our push with the Tennessean was like, you don't understand how Islamophobia works. And so people will understand when it's like maybe upfront with that ad, Muslims are going to detonate a bomb. That's obvious. But that first ad set the stage. And if you don't understand these end of time prophecies groups, you were going to overlook that ad. And so it wasn't just that Sunday's ad that they said was mistakenly placed, but they shouldn't have placed that first ad. And they should have looked more into that group. And that group, actually, they had, sent these ads to a number of newspapers across the country, but they weren't accepted. So they weren't printed. So it tells you a lot about, Tennessean making the quote unquote mistake. But I do give them credit. They were very quick to apologize for it. And the money they made from the ad, even though they pulled it as soon as on Sunday, since they found out about it, it was already printed in the paper, so you couldn't take that back. But they donated that money to AMAC for our work against Islamophobia, and they also pledged like $50,000 worth of ad space in the Tennessean for AMAC, the Muslim community, and Muslim organizations. So, but that's great in the start. We also push them that they need more cultural competency training. They need a better understanding of the Muslim community. They need a better understanding of Islamophobia, how it works, and also just interesting, just looking at, let's say, the leadership, reporters, they need more diversity within their organization and the parent organization of Gannett. Because if you had someone with a background, they would have, you know, this it was less likely for something like this to happen. So those were some of the main takeaways.
Someone just posted a question. Since the Tennessean is a Gannett paper, it didn't run in any other Gannett papers, only ours?
Yes, that's as far as I know. That it was just in the Tennessean.
And so I think you're right that an apology is one thing, and it's nice that they apologize, but you want to see concrete steps. So I know you worked with them, and you sent a letter that we also supported. What else is happening at the Tennessean, if anything? Where do things stand now?
Yeah. Well, I appreciate everyone who signed the letter. I mean, that outcry of support for our community and for everyone who reached out directly to the Tennessean and saying they were shocked to see such an ad published. So we had over 700 organizations and, including the Jewish Federation and individuals, we had council members, congressmen, sign on to that letter. And basically it was a call to action against hate of all kind, hate, against Islamophobia, but also this hate that is, the purpose of it is to divide our community. It puts who is with us and who is against us, who is otherized. And so, and we know that during an election season, that really acts of hate, hate crimes against, religiously based hate crimes against Muslim community, Islamophobia, it goes up during election cycles. And a lot of people think, well, if there's a terrorist attack, that's when there are more hate crimes against Muslims, but it's actually during election cycles. And so when we're thinking about what kind of ads we would want to put in the Tennessean, we were really thinking about how do we change this narrative, and we've been working with the Tennessean, but we also have some marketing professionals on our team. And it's very interesting because, someone who's, I was born and raised in Nashville. My kids are, second generation Americans. And, some of the ideas about the ads that were coming out from the Tennessean, they were great ideas, on one end. But I think for a Muslim community, I don't want people to support me because they sympathize with me. I mean, I don't need, I don't know how to exactly say it. I don't need to be saved. I have power of my own. I need you to stand alongside me, right? When we think about what allyship is, and it's not coming in and stepping in and saving somebody else, but asking somebody, what do you need from me, and how can I be a good ally? And so actually our first ad came out on July 17th online, and it was a video clip of one of our community leaders, Muhammad Shukri Hassan, and just telling his story, that he came as a Somali refugee, but he is very very involved in the community life in Nashville, and why is it important to him? And so it wasn't about, hey, I'm Muslim, look, I'm a good Muslim, because that narrative, good Muslim, mad Muslim, kind of plays to the Islamophobia piece, because if you're looked as a good Muslim, you're acceptable. But what is a good Muslim? Sometimes it's a Muslim who's not visibly Muslim, or a Muslim that keeps quiet and won't speak out for their rights. The definition is not Muslims aren't defining themselves, somebody else is defining who you are. And so we want to be able to define ourselves without having to try to prove our humanity. I often say, like, living in Tullahoma, as a Muslim, it's like you always have to prove you're nice. You always have to prove to other people that you're safe. You're not going to hurt them. You're a good person. But why is it my white neighbor doesn't have to prove that? By default, that person's nice. That person's a good person, right? That person's safe. But that's not my default. I have to prove it, and then I'm accepted. I kind of want to go away from that. I have to prove my humanity. That we've got to kind of change that narrative. That's my feeling. I can't speak for the entire Muslim community, but I mean, having grown up here and done it long enough, I'm tired of having to prove I belong.
I don't blame you. I think that's a great strategy and a good reminder for everybody that we need to all stand together and be allies. I hope you get great feedback to those ads. I think it's a very good strategy. You also unfortunately had a vandalism incident that same week. Do you know, were those events tied together, or what's the status on
No, it wasn't tied. The Islamic Center of Nashville put a Black Lives Matter sign. So they're on 12 South. And it's actually, a lot of people walk up and down the street. So their sign is at eye level. Somebody in the middle of the night, I think they stopped and they changed it from Black Lives Matter to All Lives Matter. So, so that's a greater issue that's going on in this country right now. I'm glad ICN had taken the stance to put Black Lives Matter, because till Black Lives Matter, all life, no life really matters. So we've got to take a strong stand on social justice issues.
Agreed. And to your point earlier that these things tend to uptick around an election cycle, I live in that neighborhood and there have been a number of incidents recent. I didn't realize that's what had happened with the sign. There have been a number of incidents recently where people have signs in the yard, either Black Lives Matter signs or election signs, and people are going around and marking on the signs.
Oh, wow.
So that trend continues. There seems to be a lot of animosity in the current climate, which is very unfortunate. What are your next steps? So are you going to keep running ads in the Tennessean, or?
So we will keep running ads, and but we want to think about how we can unite our community. And I think that first sign-on letter that published the week after the ad went out was this kind of a beginning, and trying to see how us, our allies can come together and lift up Nashville and lift up all of Nashville, and help people realize, hey, we have common values and we have a common goal, right? Our goal is a Nashville, a Middle Tennessee that everyone is valued, respected, but everyone thrives, right? So we don't have these disparities between people living in different zip codes, right? And, we talk a lot about how Nashville is the it city, but then when you dig deeper and then you see the problems between different neighborhoods, lack of school resources and other resources, and then you realize, wait, not everyone is feeling this it part of the it city, right? And you're wondering if it's just one segment of the city that's feeling it. And so then, it's a false narrative. And so what can we do to kind of bring people together and say, hey, we're going to all commit to making Nashville work for everyone who's living here?
Excellent. We're doing a lot of that same work, so we should definitely partner together on that. Another thing that I wanted to ask you about is something that we experience in our community a lot is children in schools. having problems with acceptance. So either they're the token Jewish student and the teacher's always asking them, you know, like, what do Jewish people think about blah, 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 or what do Israelis think about blah, blah, blah. And you know, that stigmatizes the kid. And also if they happen to not know the answer, it's mortifying to them because then they feel like they've let everyone down, or they just are not, you know, they get names. And we've had a number of incidents of anti-Semitism in schools. It seems largely due to ignorance more so than malice, but not always. So I'm imagining you have those same issues in your community. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So a study was done. It wasn't in Nashville, but several years ago, a study was done that 42% of kids were reported being bullied at school, and 1 in 4 of them were bullied by a teacher or somebody in administration. And to me, that's a scarier statistic. I mean, it's almost 50% of Muslims being bullied. I mean, that's bullied. We know, even if you weren't bullied, you've heard things that have kind of made you cringe, or made you keep quiet when you should have been speaking, or it had affected you in other ways. So it didn't technically count as being bullied. So that's happening in Nashville, you know, and having grown up in Nashville, I went through public schools. I graduated from Hillsborough High School. And when I started wearing a scarf in 12th grade, actually in metro schools, I was the first person to start wear a scarf in the school system. So at that time, it's interesting because, you know, the ignorance was that people did not know anything about Islam. So they didn't know anything good or bad about Islam. It didn't mean I didn't experience things, but still, I don't think it's the level of what kids are feeling today with everything in the news and the war on terrorism and just, you know, all the wars going on, right? And so now it's just almost commonplace where kids are hearing that, are you terrorists? And like Leslie, you described it exactly the same, word for word, what Jewish kids feel in terms of being that one Muslim in the classroom where the teacher comes and, you know, expects them to be the expert on their religion. And of course, we know all the kids are not experts on their religion or articulate in how to answer difficult questions. And then, you know, we had an incident where a teacher was talking about something and then looked to the Muslim kids and say, well, but he's not a terrorist, you know, like, you know, and they think they're being nice, but in fact, they are really hurting the child. And so these, you know, these kind of incidents are happening all the time. And we see with our kids, there are some kids who maybe they become stronger for it and they learn the answers, they speak back and they assert their rights. But, you know, that's hard to do, maybe, you know, but then there are a lot of,
for a kid.
right. But there are a lot of kids who end up hiding who they are, kind of being one person at home, another person at school, so they can be accepted. They will join the people who are doing the bullying. They'll join that group to kind of differentiate themselves from other Muslims. So it is hurting our kids mentally. And you know, how do they identify as Muslims? And because it takes a lot of effort. Kids just, it's, you know, being in school is hard enough, right? You know, you want to be accepted, you want to just kind of do your thing. And then to have something like, you know, bullying or having to worry about your identity or your safety just adds other layers. My kids, they went to Tullahoma High School. And so they're the only Muslims in the high school. You know, they were used to being that one Muslim kid at school in their class. And it was interesting because they would tell me they would hear anti-Semitic remarks from classmates. they would hear anti-Catholic remarks from classmates. Usually they wouldn't hear Islamophobic remarks because people would see them and say, okay, I'm not going to say it in front of them. And I was like, they're saying it, right? If they're so open about those other remarks because they don't think there weren't any Jewish kids in their school at that time. And there was like one Catholic child who heard that she was going to hell. And I know a lot of Jewish kids hear that too. And so this is something we have to work on together.
Jewish adults too, but yeah. So a couple of questions came across. One is asking, and you may not know about this, do teachers in Nashville or in the surrounding areas get cross-cultural training? Do you know?
So, the training we would like to have is not mandated. They do have training sessions like in Metro Public Schools, and my brother Rashid Fakhruddin and usually Kasar Abdullah or Suad Abdullah, they do a training on cultural diversity in the Muslim community and social emotional learning. But the thing about it, it's not a mandatory training for the teachers. And I think that's what, we need mandatory training, because it's great for those 30, 40 teachers who come, but then, who else? There's a lot of other teachers out there.
We get that same thing. We've had more success in the Nashville public schools, but in the surrounding counties, much less. And as with most trainings, it's the people who don't come who need it the most.
Exactly. Exactly.
Another question or comment about a book by Khalid Beydoun. She doesn't list the title of the book here, but
American Islamophobia.
Yes. Okay. And so the question is, would you recommend that as a book for other communities to read, to learn about the Muslim community?
Yeah, I mean, American Islamophobia is a great read to understand how Islamophobia works, because when you think about the word Islamophobia, it sounds like a phobia, an irrational fear of somebody else. But there are two words we like to use. So sometimes we use Islamophobia, and sometimes we use anti-Muslim racism. And we use them interchangeably. It means the same thing, but I think anti-Muslim racism kind of hits more to the point that, just like anti-Black racism is systemic, Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism is systemic. So he talks about the kind of the three parts of Islamophobia in terms of individual, like, people individually, they have a fear or a bias against Muslims and how they act upon it, but then a state-sponsored Islamophobia. So when you see the war on terrorism or wars abroad, well, there is a reason for elected officials or media to keep up this fear of Muslims and drive this message down, because if you drive this message that Muslims are to be feared, then you can get more support for the wars abroad. And then it's Muslim ban, or it's the Countering Violent Extremism program that was started mainly to target the Muslim community, and other registration programs. So, those are the systemic ways Islamophobia works. And then the third way is kind of how the individual and the systemic Islamophobia kind of collides. And so when people watch the news, watch the media, and so it's interesting because when there's a shooting, a mass shooting, if it's done by a Muslim, it gets 350 times more media coverage than when it's done by somebody who is white or not a Muslim. And so, what does it mean for our community when something happens and it's being recycled through the media over and over and over again, and the backlash it causes to our community?
Definitely. We tend to lash out at things that we fear. So if the message is fear you, then the lashing out comes with that. How would you say that AMAC has been received in the Tennessee legislature? Are you successful working with them? Or if you are, we could use some tips because that can be a challenge.
So, of course, AMAC was created after the 2011 anti-Sharia bill. And so I think that that bill was what really prompted our community to say, hey, we need to build a relationship with the Tennessee state legislature. So not surprisingly, there are a handful of legislators that we can go talk with and supports our community. And then the rest are the rest. This is the Tennessee state legislature we're talking about. So yeah, that's still a work in progress.
I understand. So a couple of kind of interlocking questions. Would you say within Islam that you see bias against other Muslim cultures? Do you see that? I mean, I know it happens globally, but do you see that happening in the local community? And then as a follow-up, kind of how do you keep the disparate parts together? So your community is kind of like ours. We have a number of synagogues, you have a number of different mosques. And so what draws the community together, would you say?
So it's our community is so diverse, right? You know, about a fourth of the Muslim community are African American, Black Americans, and then you know, like a fourth are Arabs, and then a fourth South Asians, and you know, the rest, you know, the rest of the races. So I mean, it's just so diverse racially, but then ethnically, where they're coming from. And then you got the differences between someone who has been born and raised here or have families that's been here generations, and then somebody who's a new immigrant. And so then you have all these differences in their understanding of Islam. And so a lot of times new immigrants will come and they want to practice Islam exactly how they did back home, not taking into account, well, the culture is different. I mean, like you have to make some kind of adjustments, and Islam allows for it. But so there's always, you know, it's always challenging. And then people don't like people coming from, let's say, one part of the world, from the Middle East. They live with their own people, their lives. They never met Muslims from Asia or African American Muslims, meeting them for the first time and relearning what you understand about Islam, because a lot of people think Islam is not just the religious practice, but they've conflated it with their cultural practices. And so the way Islam is practiced, the fundamentals of Islam is same throughout the world, but the way it's practiced can be different from culture in different cultures or races or ethnicities. So, but people a lot of times they think, because I did this back home this way, this is the way every Muslim around the world should be doing it. And so you have those kind of clashes, and it just takes time for people to know each other and understand that Islam has, you know, there's some basic fundamentals we all believe in, but it's a great description that Islam is like pure water, but you can fill different vessels with that pure water, and it'll look a little different shape, the color and tone. So you have those differences. So in Middle Tennessee, we have 11 mosques, and they're so different. There's like Saladin Center is the Kurdish mosque, Islamic Center, the Al Farouk Islamic Center is primarily Somali mosque. And then you have some that are big, Islamic Center of Tennessee that has a diverse population. Islamic Center of Nashville has now two locations in 12 South and Bellevue. There's one in Williamson County, and then there's some smaller mosques. I work with all these mosques. This morning I was literally texting all the mosque leaders because we have a program tomorrow night, and then working with mosque leaders, we're because of Friday prayers, COVID closed down all the mosques. During Ramadan, we're closed, but then in June, they start opening up in limited capacity. And then now we're trying to get them to close again. And that was been a challenge because we got some to close and then some did not close. But working with them, they're different. Leadership is all men, those challenges, are there. But everyone comes from a different place. I mean, whether it's racially, ethnically, or how the understanding of Islam, and being able to work with them and not say, well, no, everyone has to practice Islam exactly the same way to be part of our community. So we have to accept our differences within ourselves.
Can you talk a little bit more about, so you said you have a program tomorrow night. So what is it that AMAC is doing that draws the Muslim community together in Middle Tennessee?
So the program tomorrow night is literally about COVID-19 and why we have a group of physicians recommended that the mosque be closed, and how terrible the situation is in Nashville and in Tennessee at this moment, because I think the city is still open. And people, there's kind of a disconnect in terms of how bad the situation actually is. So we're going to have that discussion. We already know it's going to be a lively discussion. And then we're working on COVID education around COVID-19. And also we have a food box distribution program going on with Islamic Center of Tennessee in the Antioch area. Last Saturday, we gave out 520 boxes of food in the Antioch area. And this wasn't just for the Muslim community. I mean, I would say over half of the clients were from the Latino community, in the Antioch area. And so getting Muslims more involved. We also, with the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter, trying to educate our community members. 1/4 of our community members are, African or African American. This is our issue. And so we have to understand it and fight for those rights. And so, but I think there's more education within our community that needs to take place. And I think we feel like we're in the spot that we can really bring people together and have those conversations. So we've had 2 conversations on racism within the community and outside the community, because I believe that conversations have to start with ourselves. And then of course elections. That's the big thing right now. August 6th, trying to get information out to mosque leaders. A lot of people, they know presidential elections, but August 6th, they're kind of like, what is that? And so getting that word out and getting our community excited. Last year, Zulfat Suwaira was elected to Metro Council, and she was just well known in the community before she ran. So there was an excitement around her running. And so, kind of building on that excitement. So look, you can really make a difference in elections. And of course, the more involved we are, the more likely elected officials will look to us and ask us about issues and listen to what we have said. We say, because if we're not voting, they don't see our communities. And so just kind of driving that message in.
That's a great point. And I like to remind people as often as possible, if you live in Nashville, half of the school board is up for re-election in this election, and you should pay attention to that. It matters in all sorts of ways. If you could lobby the Tennessee legislature on one thing, what would it be? So what would you say your top legislative priority is?
Wow. You should have given me a forewarning for that. There are a lot of issues, and so and it necessarily, me personally or me as AMAC,
Let's say you as AMAC for right now.
Okay. Because I think it's one and the same, personally and AMAC. Healthcare, I mean, this lack of healthcare, universal healthcare, or it just expanded uh, healthcare in Tennessee is hurting our community members. And my husband practiced as an oncologist for many years, and he would tell me about patients. And he told me about one patient um, whose wife had, a later stage cancer, and the husband was crying and said, "Yeah, a year ago I didn't have a job, I didn't have insurance. I took my wife to a nurse practitioner, and she missed the diagnosis, or that could have been caught early." And so I think that always hits me that families are making these decisions, financial decisions, and they're taking risk with their health, and I know other incidents like that, and that affects our community, the Muslim community. A lot of people who they have a job, they're getting paid, but their job does not pay for healthcare. Now they have to figure out, are they going to pay for insurance, which is much higher rate, and if you're not working for a big company, and can they afford to pay for themselves, for the whole family, or they're just their children? And sometimes people are making that choice. I'll pay for my children's health care, I'll forego my health insurance. And I know of a friend who did that, and diagnosed with late stage cancer. And so that affects our community. But sometimes you feel like it's a lost cause. So from AMAC standpoint, a couple of years ago, the legislature reevaluated the social study curriculum, and that happened, and it happened before they were going to, like a year before they were supposed to do it. But they did it because there were some Islamophobes going to small counties talking about, why is Islam taught in middle school? And because of that, there was an outcry. So, oh, our middle schoolers are not ready to digest information about Islam. They're not that ready to digest information about any religion, like they're too young. And so what is covered in Islamic history in the social studies in 7th grade has been reduced from what it was a few years before that. And so taking out our narratives, makes it easier for Islams to come in and fill in people's heads with ideas about what Islam is, because people don't have any background knowledge. And so that really affects us in the long term. It's not something you see short term. This is something you see as we go on.
Definitely. Avi Poster, who I think has a question. He wants to know, on a lighter note, can we still buy the best pita in Nashville on Fridays in front of the Islamic Center of Nashville?
They're closed. They're closed, and then they haven't been selling any food for a while.
Will they reopen after COVID, or is it permanent?
Yeah, no, actually they were open last Friday, but I think they've like no sale of foods. But it's been difficult. Like we think there's just a health risk, and so that's why we want them to be closed. But Friday prayers are very important. Actually, it's mandatory for all adult male, and so missing it week after week has been difficult on a lot of community members. Although, like in my family, my father, he's not his health-wise, he's not doing very well, so he wouldn't be able to go to the mosque anyway. But my brothers and my sons and my nephews go to his house to have the Friday prayer. So yeah.
Modify and do the best you can.
Yes.
You mentioned that the leadership of the mosques in Nashville are mostly men. So one of the people asked, can you talk a little bit more about roles for women in Islam, and Um, are there pushes? So within different lines of Judaism, there were pushes at some point to be more inclusive of women in leadership roles and things like that. Is anything similar to that happening in the Muslim community?
So, so Muslim women will come back and say, well, Islamically, there's nothing that says a woman cannot lead. But of course, how you interpret text depends on the interpreter, right? Depends on who's looking at it. And so men will come back and say, no, man, no, this, you would interpret it this way. And so we have those fights. But if you look at the time of the Prophet, Muhammad, peace be upon him, I mean, his greatest advisor was his wife Khadija and supporter. And then, later one of his wife, Aisha, actually led an army. And after he passed away, the leader of the Muslim community appointed a woman as head of the markets, so the CEO of the markets in Medina. So there's definitely precedence there, but you have to remember there people come from different cultures that are patriarchal, and so we're always having to fight that. And I think when you look at the Quranic text, there people can't justify in any way that to keep women out of leadership positions. When I say that, I also say that, when men, say, okay, yes, we want more women on our boards or in leadership position, I always tell them, yeah, that's fine. That's great. I'm glad you want them. But have you created the culture to keep them there? And I think, whether that's in the Muslim community or in any board, business in a company or nonprofit, you have to think about, it's just, you can't just put somebody in, that's why you have the diversity and inclusion, the inclusion part, right?
Well, forget that second part.
and so that inclusion part, and having, men who normally talk and deal with issues in one way, how do you bring in a woman's voice and be respectful and actually listen? And there's still more training to be done on that. I mean, some mosques do it very well, and they try hard. Others are, they're very traditional, and women don't want to step up in the space where they're not going to be valued.
Yeah, that makes sense. Can you talk a little bit about pilgrimage? So some of our callers may not know what that is, so maybe give a quick background and what's happening with pilgrimage during COVID.
Yes, so actually the Hajj, or the pilgrimage to Mecca, is happening right now, and this is the month in the Islamic calendar Dhul Hijjah, and the first 10 days of Dhul Hijjah are supposed to be the holiest days in the Islamic calendar, and so normally you have like 3 million Muslims from around the world descend on Mecca, Saudi Arabia, where you see the black structure, which is the Kaaba. It's just a cubical building with a black cloth on it. And we believe that Prophet Abraham and his son Ismail built it originally. And so a lot of the rituals around the Hajj are connected with Prophet Ibrahim and his son. So that's a way we remember God, and it's a requirement for Muslims once in a lifetime if they can afford it, and health-wise they can make the journey to do it. So this year with COVID-19, I mean, really back in December, they had decided that nobody could, because you can visit the Kaaba any time of the year, but they had stopped anyone from visiting the Kaaba because it's, even outside of Hajj, it's crowded. And so they canceled Hajj for anyone outside of Saudi Arabia. And I think they're only having people who live within Saudi Arabia be able to complete the Hajj this year. So it's not like, because that would be a hard, that would be a terrible way of spreading COVID, because 3 million people descending on one city in one area, and there's no social distancing during Hajj. It's very crowded. So, but it's just for locals this year.
All right. Are you working on the census as well? Or, I imagine getting people counted is part of what leads to representation later. So.
Yes, we are working on the census. And this year, when you fill out the census, you'll see race and ethnicity section. I mean, it's always been there, but this year you can be more specific about where you're from. And so I think that, that information will really help our community, because we really need to capture the numbers. When usually I tell people in Middle Tennessee, there are about 40,000 Muslims. Well, we got that number from the FBI, which means the FBI has a count of our community members. Yeah, it's nice to know, I guess. But there's no religious question, so you wouldn't know, just in previous census or other surveys how many Muslims. So how do you extrapolate that? Well, if you know what countries they're coming from, if somebody can say that they are from Asia, and then they're Arab, but then be able to say I'm Egyptian, I'm Lebanese, I'm Syrian, then we can get a more accurate count of our community. And then there are communities that, oftentimes in the past, they kind of fell through the cracks, because in the past, Kurdish community members were told, oh, just put white, or Arab community members were told, put white. And you don't get the privilege of being white, but you're being counted as white. So now they can actually put that they're Kurdish underneath, or be more specific, what part geographically where they're from. And so I think that is that will be good for our community. Now, getting our community to fill it out, we're still working on that. COVID hit right before the census, right when the census went live, COVID hit. And, April 1st was like the big rollout date. And so we had to cancel we had 3 events in the Muslim community around census. So we had to cancel that. So we're trying to see how we can kind of capture election and voting and people's interest in what's going on, whether they vote or not, and filling out the census. So there's a lot more work to be done.
Always. Are there other books or resources that you would recommend for others to learn more about Islam? Okay, in the other room, I have a book, I think it's called Islam, Racism, and Global Politics. But I'll have to share that name and author with you. And I think when we talked about how the war on terrorism affects the Muslim community in America, I think that one does a good job of explaining that. We already mentioned Khalid Beydoun's American Islamophobia. I think that's a really good book. And there's one other book just on Islam in general. Let's see. I was forgetting her name. If you wanted to read something not written by a Muslim, there's one called Muhammad, but I'm forgetting her name. I'm terrible. Okay, we can put those out later if you want.
Yeah.
That would be great. How are you? Another question came across. How are you getting out the vote in your community?
So now everything's online. Normally, we do a lot more within the mosque. one way we're doing it is we're sending, well, of course, we're kind of getting leaders in the communities to and push out their friends and families. And I think that's become like a big thing now among voter engagement circles about relationship voting, and trying to get people to actually reach out to their friends and family and go vote together and have that kind of personal relationship on voting. Also, we've gotten the voter registration list from Davidson County, and literally we went through the list and took out all Muslim sounding names. And we'll send text messages, and so we also see that there are community leaders, like influencers in the communities, that have, if they say something, it has more of an impact on individuals. And so, really getting them to be more vocal about it. And I think, a lot of times election comes and we're like, oh, go vote. And people don't even, people are like, what is August 6th primary? Like, what does that mean? Who's running? Or they don't know the issues. They don't know what they're voting on. And so I think there's got to be more education on what the issues are. And I think we want to do some more webinars on like equity and education and jobs and economics and things like that, so people have that opportunity to learn what the issues are.
The Equity Alliance just put out voting guides for Memphis, Nashville, and Chattanooga.
Yeah, we shared it.
Yeah, they did a really good job, I think, of talking about the different issues and helping to educate people. Another question, do you have a sense of what percentage of the Muslim community is engaged in vote? So what are your turnout rates? Do you feel like they're similar to the rest of Tennessee, which is not good in general, or?
Yeah, well, that's so hard to say, because we don't have, we haven't been able to capture, like, we have voting lists, but then so many of them, don't actually have a cell phone number. And so, you can't reach them out through that method. And it's been very difficult to capture that. So yeah, if somebody has some more ideas.
Yeah, it's very true. It's not so hard to register people to vote. You know how to do that, but then actually getting them to the polls is a much trickier thing. So I think that's the $1 million question for everyone. We have just a couple of minutes left. So I know we talked a little bit before we let everyone else onto the call about the situation in Williamson County with their seal. I think a lot of people didn't know that they even had a seal, much less what was on it. And so as we discussed a little bit, it not only has a Confederate flag on it, but also a cross. So we've been thinking about, we've been asked by some of our community members to reach out. So can you talk a little bit about, from your perspective, what does it mean when an official symbol has a cross on it?
Yeah, it means somebody has defined who belongs and who doesn't belong, right? And it's just like, they had the state legislature required a couple of years ago that every school has "In God We Trust." And for me as a Muslim, that's fine. I have nothing wrong with that saying. We call that tawakkul, putting your trust in God. But we understood where that came from, right? Who proposed that? Why? And that wanting to show that this is a Christian country, Christian school, even though it's a public school, right? And that's who belong, and then everyone else are outsiders. And so when you see a seal like that with a cross on it, of course, we know why the Confederate flag is problematic, but the cross it just defines and further divides us, defines who belongs, and divides us into us and them, and we're perpetually being otherized, and we have to stop that.
Definitely. That's kind of the perspective we're going to be taking on it as well, is that I think to them it's a sign of love and welcome and
Yeah.
all of that. And it's conveying that it doesn't mean that to everybody.
Mhm.
And in God we trust in the schools thing. At my daughter's school, they printed the sign because the state made them,
Yeah.
but they hid it underneath the counter in the school office so that no one could actually see it, which they really appreciated. So we're at the end of our time. Thank you so much for being with us today and talking to us about issues that are going on in the Muslim community and AMAC and what your goals are. I look forward to working with you again in the future. We have a lot of similar program and goals, so I look forward to that. Next week, everyone, please join us. We'll be having Metro Councilwoman Sharon Hurt come to talk about what's going on in the city council, and in particular, her bill to reduce problematic practices in the police department. And so a lot of those bills got pulled from the Metro Council this week, but hers is still going forward. And so she'll have an update on that, as well as taking questions about other things. So thank you again, Sabina, for joining us. And thank all of you for participating. And we hope to see you again next week. Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Thank you, Sabina.
Thank you.
You.